got a live stream one going, and then this one too. It sounds like it's working now. Right? Doesn't it sound like it's working? All y'all in the back can hear? Okay, great, great. Then in the interest of making sure we're super respectful of all of your time, thank you very, 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 very much, 100 times over for coming. Please give yourselves a round of applause for being engaged. Our 100th town hall since I took office. And while I'd like to take credit for that, the credit is not mine to take. It's the team that I have, an amazing team who I'm sure you'll hear more about this evening. A fierce team of 18 and 18 only. That's federally mandated. People who do all of the things. I was doing some math just while I was waiting. They answer 200 phone calls or emails each a week. And so that and all of the other kinds of things that they do, I am very much in debt to my team for welcoming you here today. Basically, the capacity of this room is around 100, a little bit more. So if you look around, this is how many different times we've gathered together in the 7 years that I've been in office. And whether it's live, as we are here today, or live stream, and we are also live streaming this right now on a big conference call, which of course many of you did and participated in during COVID particularly, providing transparency is really, really important. Accountability is really, really important for me. It's important that I show up here. It's important that I show up all over our community. And it's just as important for you to show up too. And so for that, I'm enormously grateful. In fact, I would argue that now more than ever, it's important that we show up and that we have face-to-face conversations wherever possible. So before we dig into the town hall, I want to go ahead and take a minute or two to begin the way that we always do for those who've participated in town halls before. If I could have the next slide. Here's the agenda. Today, as with some of our town halls, we have a little bit of content for you, that's something new that can be hopefully enriching. And this particular content is to talk about the Constitution, the reason why we're all here. We will also have time for audience questions and answers. You guys each should have a piece of paper where you can write your questions on, and you also should have one of these, which is a list of accomplishments and stuff like that. And then we'll have a little closing remarks, and we'll try to get you guys out of here on time. Next slide, please. Speaking of getting us all out of here on time, I took a little out of the classroom. I used to be a high school chemistry teacher, and one thing that I learned from being a high school chemistry teacher and also being a business person is it's really important to establish how we're going to behave with one another before we get started. Whether we're in a classroom or in a lecture hall, or whether we're in a meeting, having norms or standards of treating one another is really important. So to that end, we do this every time. Please, let's leave our titles and everything else that we brought in at the door, and we are all here as patriots. We all love our country. We all love our families. Full stop. Please make sure that we use our time wisely, and I'll try to do that, and I can tell I'm already over time. Any conflict we will be addressing by the issue and not with the person, and that's really important in this particular age when we are constantly seeing poor behavior from one another. And lastly, we will be discussing policies, not politics here. And that's really important. In my capacity here today, I am here as your elected official. I am not here as a candidate. This is not anything that is a campaign event. This is an official event, and I will make sure I draw the lines on where the ethics are for that as well. That's the next slide, and we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. As I mentioned, you guys each have a card. Please do, if you have questions, write your questions down. We're going to be handing them into our team members. And Kyle, who is going to be our man of the hour, he's going to be, I'll introduce him later, we'll be sorting those questions out. We do this so that we make sure we're efficient with our time, so that if there's 10 questions on immigration or 10 on the Epstein files, then we don't ask 10 questions on the same question over and over again, and he will be moderating the questions. Please make sure it's legible too, and just hand it to the aisles just like in school. Next slide. So, without further ado, I think I'm 1 minute off. I started late. Okay. Honestly, guys, this last 6 months or so has been really jarring in a way that I haven't experienced in the 7 years or so that I've been in this office. And whether you agree with what President Trump is doing right now with his administration, or you wonder what's happening to America right now, the pace, no matter what way you think about it, has just been furious. And it has been a real shock to the system for many of us trying to just keep up and to try to understand what's happening. On a personal level, maybe, on a district level, certainly, and of course on a national level as well. It's been a lot in the last 6 or 7 months. It's been a lot for healthcare. It's been a lot for science, for our economy, our personal finances. Even Congress's role, my role, has really been turned upside down in a lot of ways in the last 6 months, and we can talk about that as well. Again, whichever way you land on what's happening, the administration has very much taken away many of the standard guardrails that we are used to as a society, and that has caused a lot of turmoil. And I think it's worthy of recognizing that. The results of President Trump's second term will remain in many ways to be seen, and that's why I wanted to talk with our special guest who's here tonight. I wanted help from an expert, and indeed you are one, sir, an expert of the Constitution, because I want to understand, and I'm sure you guys do too, what is the Constitution all about? Is it under assault? And if it is, can it hold? It's a real privilege to welcome our guest tonight, Jeffrey Rosen. Jeffrey is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center of Philadelphia. He leads this important institution, but he also hosts We the People, which is a weekly podcast of constitutional debate. He's a professor at the George Washington University Law School and a contributing person to The Atlantic. He was previously a legal affairs editor of the New Republic and a staff writer for the New Yorker. So Jeffrey is not only all of those things, but he's also author of the New York Times bestseller book that's called Conversations with RGB, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on Life, Love, Liberty, and Law, as well as biographies of Louis Brandeis and William Howard Taft. A new book of his is called Pursuit of Happiness, How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspire the Lives of the Founders and Defined America, which will inform a lot of our discussion tonight. So please join me in a warm welcome of Jeffrey. And so, as I mentioned, some of our town halls, and by show of hands, how many have been to a town hall before? Okay, so about half, maybe a third. Our town halls sometimes have these content front end loaded, so we may do one on education or healthcare, or in this case, the Constitution. And so today, what we'll start with is a couple of questions that I would assume that a lot of people would ask. I'll spend 15 minutes doing that, and then we will turn to the questions that you guys are likely interested in, which may or may not have to do with the Constitution, but thank you very much for joining us. So I do have more questions than I have time for. As you guys are probably writing your questions, many of you might be writing questions about housing or groceries or education or healthcare, those kinds of basic issues that are what I call the no-duh agenda. You may be writing questions about the border or security. But the Constitution doesn't tell us anything really about any of these things, even things like AI. So why should we care about the Constitution in our everyday life?
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here, and congratulations on your 100th Town Hall.
Thank you.
I always begin all of our programs at the Constitution Center, the podcasts and the in-person convenings, by reciting the mission statement that came from Congress when it created the Constitution Center during the bicentennial of the Constitution. The NCC is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people on a nonpartisan basis. What an inspiring charter during the bicentennial for you, Congress, to create this beautiful temple to the Constitution. That's what it is. You've got to go see it if you haven't been to us recently in Philly, right on Independence Hall, across from Independence Mall, the most inspiring views of the hall in America, with live theater, programs for kids, a new exhibit we're opening for 2026 about founding principles with a rare copy of the Constitution. It's just so inspiring. But in addition to all that, it's a national education platform, and we bring together liberals and conservatives to debate the Constitution on all platforms. So the core of the educational materials, which you've got to check out if you haven't seen it, is the interactive Constitution. It's gotten 100 million hits since we launched in 2015. It's now among the most Googled constitutions in the world. And it brings together liberals and conservatives to debate every clause of the Constitution. So you can see Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Katyal with 1,000 words about what they agree the habeas corpus clause means, and then separate statements about what they disagree about. Multiply that by 80 clauses, 160 scholars. It's incredibly rich, and it's also incredibly inspiring to see these people who disagree strongly about the Constitution exploring areas of agreement and disagreement. And that's my answer to your question. Why should we care about the Constitution? It's the one document that unites us. It expresses the American idea: liberty, equality, and democracy, separation of powers, federalism, and the Bill of Rights. This is what binds Americans, not our background, not our race, creed, or color, but our devotion to this idea. And what's so inspiring, you said that these are very polarized times, and they are indeed. We're more polarized than any time since the Civil War. But it's so striking to go around the country and realize that Democratic or Republican people disagree about how to balance these ideals about liberty, equality, and democracy, but they're united by an allegiance to these ideals. And it's really striking that at the most testing times in American history, and this is definitely one of them, you find patriots like John Quincy Adams, right before the Civil War, warning Americans that unless we rediscover our allegiance to the ideals of the Constitution and the Declaration, we're going to descend into violence. And that's been the story. Thankfully, violence has been rare in American history, insurrections and riots, the Civil War, after Reconstruction, resistance to the Civil Rights Movement. It's been, thankfully, the exception, not the rule. But it happens when we stop debating and discussing the Constitution, and that's why it's so important to be here today.
Well, and that kind of leads to my next question, which is I am an engineer and I'm not a lawyer. So, and my father is a student of history and a scholar of history. But like many people, don't really have a solid background in history, and clearly you do too. I want to ask you about whether or not you feel like we're in a constitutional crisis now, as in reflection of our history. Were there times when you felt like, based on your understanding and expertise, that we were indeed in a constitutional crisis, and does this look like that now?
It's an important question, and the most widely accepted definition of a constitutional crisis is when the president ignores an unambiguous order of the US Supreme Court. And remarkably, that's never actually happened in American history. President Andrew Jackson supposedly said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it, about a case involving Native Americans, but he didn't actually say it, although he may have felt the sentiment, because the court never ordered him to do anything. Lincoln, during the Civil War, briefly refused to obey an order by Chief Justice Taney when he suspended habeas corpus, but Taney was operating by himself as a district judge and not on behalf of the whole court, and Lincoln soon called Congress into session, and Congress ratified his decision to suspend habeas. So it's never actually happened. Now, of course, the Civil War itself was a constitutional crisis because it was an unconstitutional effort to secede by the South, and violence settled that question. But that's the definition that I accept, and by that standard, we're not in a constitutional crisis. There's been talk about ignoring judicial opinions, but thankfully the president has not done that, either even lower court opinions, but certainly an unambiguous order of the Supreme Court. In a recent oral argument involving nationwide injunctions, the Solicitor General significantly committed the administration to respecting decisions by appellate courts and the US Supreme Court, which was significant. I know, of course, people disagree, and others think we are in a crisis, but that would be my answer.
And by the definition that you've given, then my next question was, some would argue that we're in a constitutional crisis right now because Congress is abdicating its responsibilities and not doing the things that it's by Article 1 required to do. By your definition, it sounds like that wouldn't be how you would define that. Can you understand why people might see that as being a problem from our three co-equal branches of government?
Absolutely, and the fact that Congress is not operating the way the framers anticipated, and that the presidency has expanded in ways that none of the framers could have imagined, and that the courts are rubber stamping this expansion of executive power, has definitely changed the balance, whether or not you call it a crisis. I have a new book coming out in October about how the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson has defined all of American history. And it begins with the following scene. Hamilton is at Jefferson's house for dinner. This is the dinner party that defined America, not the one in the room where it happened that's in the musical. This is a year later. And at some point in the evening, Hamilton says to Jefferson, "Who are those three guys on the wall?" And Jefferson said, "These are my three visions of the greatest men in history, John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton." Hamilton pauses for a while and he says, "The greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar." And Jefferson writes in his diary, "This proves that Hamilton is for a monarchy bottomed on corruption." And he goes on to found the Democratic Republican Party in supposed opposition to the Caesarist ambitions of Hamilton. And he charges the Federalists with wanting to consolidate executive power, subvert democratic elections, and establish a permanent dictator. Now, what's so amazing about this story is Hamilton was almost certainly joking, because in the Federalist Papers, he also warns of this Caesar-like demagogue who might take advantage of a foreign policy crisis, consolidate power, and call off elections. So both Hamilton and Jefferson are afraid of the resurrection of a kind of kingly monarch or a Caesar-like character. And for the rest of American history, we've debated, has Caesar arrived? So both Hamilton and Jefferson think Aaron Burr is a would-be Caesar because he wants to lead an insurrection in Spanish Louisiana and set himself up as a dictator, a kind of emperor. Some people called Andrew Jackson, Lincoln, and FDR a Caesar. FDR actually dresses up like Caesar for one of his birthday parties, and Eleanor is dressed like a Roman matron. I mean, he kind of was making fun of it. But it's a very serious question today. Is President Trump Julius Caesar or Andrew Jackson? Is he consolidating power and subverting elections in a way that really threatens democracy in a way we haven't seen before? Or is he a populist who's shrinking the size of the federal government in ways that Jackson did? I think it's too early to answer that question. History needs time to reach its judgments, but there's no question that the structural changes that you identified, in particular, the fact that Congress, which the framers thought would be the most dangerous branch, sucking all power into its impetuous vortex, as James Madison said, has become completely supine because of polarization. This is not a Democratic or a Republican thing. It's just Congress has stopped doing its job. It's delegated vast amounts of power to the executive. The executive has also asserted itself as a kind of populist tribune of the people, which started not recently, but in 1912, in the Progressive Era, both Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, for the first time, say the president directly represents the people and channels their will and question the separation of powers. And ever since then, executive power has hugely expanded, and Democrats and Republicans have used executive orders to do what they can't get through Congress because Congress isn't doing anything. And then we have this very aggressive endorsement of this theory of the unitary executive, as it's called, by the US Supreme Court, which basically says the president should have vast power to be able to fire anyone he appoints, and in foreign policy can't be checked at Congress at all.
Well, that actually leads to my last couple of questions, so we make sure we have time, and they're related. On the one hand, if you're a person who believes, to your point, that there is a practicality to having a powerful executive branch, and see this as not necessarily a bad thing, or there are certainly many in the room who think that they're horrified possibly by the actions of the executive branch right now. What do we do to right the ship one way or the other to restore what I think is a better balance of power that we all agree needs to be done, so that the Congress takes its rightful place, so that the president doesn't overreach? Do you think that you don't believe we're in a constitutional crisis, but we clearly are at a very stressed situation. What would you say to the people who both appreciate what President Trump is doing and those who are very alarmed by it?
Educate yourself about the Constitution. It's your right and your responsibility. I have the privilege of hosting this podcast every week that brings together Republicans and Democrats to talk about the constitutional issues in the news. I feel like I can't have an informed opinion about the Supreme Court cases until I've heard the arguments on both sides, because they're complicated. They're going to come out in different ways. President Trump's going to win some of them and lose others. by geeking out on the podcast, and I really invite you to do it because it's exciting as a citizen to be able to empower yourself by digging into these arguments. I got a sense, months before the courts began to weigh in, that the courts were likely to strike down the tariffs. Both our conservative and our liberal guests said there's no way those are justified by the emergency economic statute that President Trump's invoked. That the birthright citizenship case, when the courts eventually hear it, he's likely to lose. But he may well continue to win cases involving his power to fire DOJ officials and education department officials, and basically he's going to have a lot of discretion to really change the size of the federal government. The reason it's empowering for you to do that is because then you can make up your own minds about what really seems to be threatening norms in ways that are unusual historically. Some argue that the threats against the law firms and the media really represent a violation of norms, if not of law, that keeps the president out of telling journalists and lawyers what to think and write, and in that sense represents a threat to the rule of law. I think, punditry is not ever a good idea for the Supreme Court, but the consensus is if those law firm cases make it up to the courts, the president may lose those too, because there's a strong protection for the independence of lawyers in the Constitution. I know these answers are long, there's not, and people are going to, reasonably disagree about what should prevail and what shouldn't, but by really digging into the cases, you can decide for yourself, are these things that the courts are broadly blessing with just a few exceptions, or is the challenge to the rule of law so serious that we're seeing something that we haven't seen before in American history?
And that's kind of one of the reasons why, as we started the conversation at the podium, it's so important to have these face-to-face opportunities and to listen to one another and to seek knowledge independently of the streams that we get them from, because I know that what I say matters. And so I try really, really hard to think really, really hard before I say something without really, really understanding it. And that is sometimes to my detriment and to the detriment of our community. But I feel like that we each individually as citizens have a responsibility to educate ourselves and to speak with knowledge and to learn. And that's why I really appreciate the chance to talk to you, because we don't always agree. I'm clear that we don't always agree, but you come with so much better knowledge and information than I will ever have. It's your livelihood and your life to know this, that I have to be respectful and I have to try to listen. And I do listen to a lot of podcasts because that's my way of learning, but other people have other ways. Do you have any things that I should have asked you before we move on?
Well, first of all, you're modeling what a thoughtful public official and citizen should do, is listen respectfully, convene differing points of view. Your rules of civility for the town hall are exactly what the founders hoped for. When George Washington in his farewell address says, 2 things are necessary to stop America from going the way of Greece and Rome and every other republic and succumbing to demagogues. The founders are really concerned about this. First, learning the principles of the Constitution, and second, the habits of civil dialogue, how to disagree without being disagreeable, how to listen to the other side. That requires doing something like convening face-to-face, as you're doing here, which is why I'm so honored to be here. It also requires, if I may, putting down our phones and actually reading. I did this really unusual, yeah, we can applaud that. This book I just wrote, I spent a completely weird year reading the moral philosophy that inspired Jefferson when he put that phrase in the Declaration of Independence. Cicero and Epictetus, I found Jefferson's reading list, and I thought, this is a gap in my education. I've just got to fill it. I spent a year following Jefferson's schedule, getting up before sunrise, reading moral philosophy, writing sonnets. I still can't believe I did this. But the takeaway for me, I realized I'd gotten out of the habit of reading. I'm just as addicted to these screens as everyone else, and I've told myself that browsing and surfing was a substitute for reading. My new rule is I'm not getting up before dawn and reading moral philosophy now, but the rule is when I wake up, I have to read before I'm allowed to browse or surf. And it's like, a half hour or an hour. It's totally changed my life. I was able to write this new book about Hamilton and Jefferson. You can do creative works in the morning. And I go around talking to folks, and we're addicted to these things. Everyone knows we are. And just not taking the time to empower ourselves and educate ourselves is first of all, we're failing to learn and grow. It's so much more fulfilling to learn, but also we're not doing our job as citizens. We live in an amazing time. It just blows my mind that all the books in the world are on our screens and Kindles if we want for free, and all the great music of history. All we need is just to take the time to read them, not to get mad and go to blogs, but to actually read and learn, and to gather as you're doing in this town hall.
Awesome,
So
awesome.
keep it up.
And thank you, I appreciate the conversation. And what we're gonna do now is we're gonna transition over to the open question and answer portion. And I'd love for you to hang with me and pipe in on anything that you'd like to. I will try and do my very best to answer your questions. But to do that, we have invited Kyle, one of the most amazing people in our community, faith leader and educator, to join us. He and I have things in common, but one is that we both taught at Simon Gratz at different times, but he is an amazing person. So please, Kyle, please join us. You're larger than life over here. And if you haven't had a chance to turn in your cards, please hand them to our amazing team, and we will start the question portion.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We will move as expeditiously as possible. Please forgive me if I misread handwriting. The first question is from Anne, and what we're going to try to do is make sure that we represent the topics of the questions that are coming in. And I should say at the outset, very briefly, any question that is not responded to in this venue, the Congresswoman's office will indeed make sure that you get a response. We do appreciate that in advance. The first question is from Anne. Aside from demonstrations and contacting our representatives, how can we best resist the current administration's policy?
This is a question that I get asked a lot, which is, what can I do besides doom scrolling and staying up too late and yelling at my spouse? All of those things I do. I would say, again, and at the end of our conversation, I'll have this advice, regardless of how you think. Get engaged and get involved. Put down your phone, figure out what you're passionate about. As an example for me, when President Trump was first elected, I was raised by a Democrat and a Republican. I come from a family that's largely split down the middle. I am all about service. And he, for me, was a very different kind of a decision. And so for me, my decision was to figure out how I could work within that. And I decided for me that I would run for office. That I thought that I had the background to hopefully bring a sensibility to what is a very difficult time, and I thought that this was how I could contribute. But for you all, for people who are trying to figure out how to deal with a very, very confusing time, everyone has a different thing that they can do, and different things they can do at different times in their life. I was at the funeral today of a very dear friend who passed away at the age of 55, who spent his life growing corporate social responsibility concepts. And the way he gave back was by making sure that we recognize that for-profit companies, the economy itself, can be more than just about maximizing shareholder value. He gave 20 years of his life to that. And so that's how he contributed. My daughter is a theater director. She contributes by trying to bring beauty, but also thoughtfulness, to our world and challenge us to think differently. And so each one of us can do that, and it doesn't have to be our job. It can just be our side hustle, for lack of a better way of describing it, and figuring out what do we do to just have a conversation. Even just having a conversation, I had a conversation with a woman, and some of you may have heard this story, who was a pumpkin salesperson. She had a farm stand. I pulled over to buy pumpkins because I never have 5 minutes, and there was pumpkins. And I pulled over, and we had this conversation where she asked if she could video me. And I said, you're welcome to, but I just want to make sure you know before you do that I'm your elected representative down in Washington. And she said, oh, well, what party are you from? And I said, you know, well, what do you think? And I described, I'm a veteran, I'm an engineer, I'm a business person or whatever. And I said, and I'm a Democrat. And she said, well, is it okay? And she turned to her back to this pumpkin that had been carved this big with Trump on it. And I said, yes, it's totally okay. And she said, well, I like President Trump because he's good for business. And so, like, it's good to have those conversations of, like, I'm standing at a pumpkin stand and we're having a conversation about the fact that we both are small business people. And we just happen to think differently about things. So I would just encourage you to question yourself about what kind of thing you can do to independently contribute.
Absolutely, here on all fronts. I learned that for the founders, the phrase "the pursuit of happiness" meant not feeling good, but being good, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but long-term virtue. And by virtue, they really meant being a lifelong learner. They thought that personal self-government was necessary for political self-government. To be good citizens in a democracy, we have to be good people, not driven by our angers and our unreasonable passions, but opening ourselves up to helping others and to learning. And it's incredibly fulfilling to learning, and it's really empowering. And there's so many things you can learn about. Your background as a teacher in science is so inspiring. I'm passionate about inspiring people to learn about history, and it just blows your mind how empowering it is. I feel like I can have so much of a more nuanced sense of the challenges we face by seeing how our people have faced them in the past. Plus, it's really interesting because history is all about storytelling, and it's just so compelling. Ken Burns is releasing in November his amazing documentary on the American Revolution. It's just his greatest work. We're going to launch it with him at the Constitution Center and do all sorts of educational efforts around the country, traveling around throughout 2026 with Ken Burns and the historians in the film, talking about the big ideas of the Declaration: liberty, equality, and democracy. And it's very, I wouldn't say it's reassuring, because you never know how history is going to turn out. That has to do with fate and with decisions that are beyond all of our control. But it is very empowering, and it's extremely interesting. And I think it is inspiring about America itself. What I learned studying history, we're not supposed to agree in America. It's having the productive debate, that productive tension that sustains the idea. There's this amazing fact that after Hamilton dies in the duel, Jefferson puts Hamilton's bust across from his own in the entrance hall in Monticello. You can see it when you go there now, it's still there. And when he passed the bust, Jefferson would smile and say, "Opposed in life as in death." And isn't that moving? I mean, he saw Hamilton not as some hated adversary who he had to destroy, but as a respected kind of civic friend who he would engage with. We've got to get that back.
And what I will say, because I know we got to move on, is this is a real story from the halls of DC. My father is a survivor of the Holocaust. He was 5 almost when he came here. He survived in the care of a Christian family, hidden in plain sight with forged documents. Ukraine is where he was born. It was Poland at the time and is now Ukraine. All of the things that are going on in Washington right now about fighting for Ukraine are personal in many ways, because this is the way I was raised about the history of that region. I was on the floor of the House of Representatives when Johnson was trying to decide whether or not we could vote on more money for Ukraine. And I had an opportunity to speak to him one-on-one. And I said, "Sir, you know, I want to reintroduce myself because it's a big place. I want to tell you about my story," which I did. And then I said, "You know how you really want to go to the 80th commemoration of D-Day? I appreciate that. But you know we didn't have to have D-Day if we had done something differently before." And I hope that that conversation and that bit of knowledge helped, because it wasn't me and me alone, but it was, hopefully, an erosion on, you know, this, like, what are we doing? Why are we not helping?
Your story is so incredibly moving and inspiring. I have to share, my ancestors also came from Ukraine, fleeing anti-Semitic violence. My grandmother, who died at the age of 101, remembered seeing the heads of Jews on sticks when her parents were fleeing from the Russians. And they came to America in search of liberty, and their story, like everyone has an immigrant story, because we're all immigrants, even the Puritans. that's the best of America.
Yeah.
That's why we're all here. I was just coming over in the cab from the station. The Uber driver's a recent guy from Saudi Arabia. He's like, this is, there are challenges here, but I love America because it gives me, he called it freedom of navigation, but he meant it freedom to choose his career and where to live, and even to be able to give people food. He said in Saudi Arabia, you have to apply for a permit before you can give food to people who need it, and here he was free to do it. So, you know, it's very important to remember for all of the problems of our politics, it's still the freest and most inspiring
amazing
country.
nation.
It's amazing.
Let's go ahead to the next question, Kyle. Sorry
takes
to
so
take so
long
long on that one. It's important though.
This question perhaps is most representative of the many on this topic. Congresswoman, considering the latest, and it is from Beton, I believe, hopefully I said that right. Considering the latest diplomatic tsunami, does the Israeli war in Gaza constitute a just war?
No, and that's a really interesting and very fair question. And I've really struggled with this. I'm an enormous ally of Israel's. I very much believe in Israel's right to exist. And I am horrified, as I think we all are, by the actions of Hamas. And this has been a brutal, brutal, brutal war. I am not a fan of Benjamin Netanyahu, but that doesn't mean that I'm not a supporter of Israel. And so I've tried my very hardest to navigate this process in terms of what I'm able to do, whether I'm able to vote or my voice, to express my disdain or my support for a variety of different things. What does that look like? It meant that I and many others put our foot down and wouldn't allow the then Speaker Johnson to vote for additional military aid for Israel without humanitarian aid. And we sat on it forever. And we also, I think it is important to see that there's a huge humanitarian crisis right now. And we have been very vocal about that in our office, and as well, there will be a letter that's coming out tomorrow from a bunch of, I don't know how many ended up signing it, but Sean Casten, Representative Casten, led it, decrying the humanitarian organization that is clearly ineffective and asking our administration to justify why this is such a tragedy and such a train wreck.
You can't justify starvation.
And genocide at the hands of Netanyahu.
And you voted
Needs
for
to
it.
be called
I-
out.
You voted for it when you cut
And it
UNRWA.
needs to stop.
You said you voted for the starvation when you cut UNRWA funding.
I did not vote for cutting
You
UNRWA.
voted for war crimes when you funded.
And I have called out war crimes over and over again.
When you said that they were going to commit war crimes.
Violate the First Amendment rights of Mahmoud Khalil.
That one we
in
should,
May last year.
that one we should talk about separately. I'm happy to talk about that one. So as you can see, there are also,
The question was, is it a just war? This was the question.
at this point in time, I very much question what's happening with this war. I don't believe what's happening. I believe that there are war crimes happening daily. And I believe I'm not in that place. Again, I'm very careful with how I speak. Very, very careful with how I speak.
Because you took a lot of money from AIPAC. They're your biggest donor this past.
I would appreciate it if we could have a civil conversation, and I'd be happy to sit down with you over those kinds of numbers and that conversation.
Okay.
I appreciate that, though. So I understand that this is very, very complicated, and it's horrible. I mean, it's truly horrible. And I hope that we will be able to find a way to stop this war and find peace. And I am interested very much in understanding what's going on in Europe with France and with England in terms of their recognition, because that's new to me. And I'll be honest, I'm trying to figure out what that means. Because what I very much want to see is a two-state solution and peace immediately. And I've called for that for 2 years now. And at the same time, I very much believe in the faith, in the importance of the Jewish state.
For what it's worth, 75% of Jewish Israelis support ethnic cleansing.
I'm sorry, sir.
Sir,
We're sorry. We want to remind everyone of the norms.
clearly
that
you and I do not agree on that, but I appreciate your input very much.
We want to remind everyone politely and respectfully of the norms that we heard the Congresswoman say, which allows for everybody to be heard in a just and a fair format. So thank you for the question, and thank you for answering. The next question Should the Supreme Court, and there were also several along these lines, David asked, should the Supreme Court be term limited? So each president has an equal input.
I actually am very intrigued by some of the proposals on term
Limits for Supreme Court members. I think that that's one way that we could possibly see a better and more robust turnover in the Supreme Court, and I think that's important. I am not necessarily supportive of a larger Supreme Court. I know that historically we've gone back and forth on that, and I haven't found in my understanding of that any real reason to be supportive of that. But in many ways, similarly with Congress, I think that there's a cycle by which we ought to kind of not literally die in office. And I think, unfortunately, that's where we are with the Supreme Court. And that, to me, is not something that, unfortunately, I feel like we as a Congress have the appetite to legislate on, which is one of my hugest frustrations of being sitting in front of you guys right now, is I'd love to address many of these questions sanely, in a setting where we can sit down and actually have a conversation about this. But the reality is, instead of actually having a civil conversation with many of you guys, which I really appreciate that we're doing right now, my colleagues and I don't do that. We spend week after week after week voting on pieces of legislation that do nothing but provoke, and some of them have just been mentioned, but provoke some of the anger and animosity between groups and factions and opinions. And that's just toxic. And it's literally designed, these votes every week. I've voted 50 different times on this, what is anti-Semitic, what isn't anti-Semitic. And at some point, I literally stopped voting on them because I wanted to say, listen, we got to fund the government. And before we continue to bat these ideas back and forth in our voting process, we need to do our goddamn job. In Congress. And right now, all we're doing is provoking you all and making the divisions even deeper. So that's my opinion on the Supreme Court, and that's my opinion on Congress right now.
Just a brief thought on the Supreme Court. The best part of my job is I'm not allowed to have opinions at all, but I can share with you that the National Constitution Center brought together 3 teams of really powerful liberal, conservative, and libertarian scholars and asked them to propose amendments to the Constitution, and all of them agreed in the space of a week, which I watched on Zoom, and I felt like I was watching the founders. That was the high level of the debate. They agreed on 5 amendments to the Constitution, and the first one was term limits for justices, 18-year term limits, embraced by the liberals and the conservatives and the libertarians. It could be done, as you say, it probably has to be a constitutional amendment, although some people think it could be a statute, but that's a great example of a reform that there could be bipartisan support for.
I'm also supportive of, the Republican Party does some really good stuff in the way that they manage the House, the Congress. They have term limits effectively on chairmanships. And that, I think, is an enormously important thing. It causes people not to sort of sit in place forever, which is unfortunately what Democrats do. And I think that really creates the opportunity not only for there to be new people in the chairmanship positions or the ranking member positions, but also, frankly, I think it creates a churn where people leave. And I think that that's important too. Next question.
This question is not named. This, however, is from Judith. Is there no limit to free speech? Can someone say hateful, false, and incriminating things with no accountability? What advice do you have when someone claims they can say anything at all?
So I'm not a lawyer, and this is one of the things that I struggle with a lot, like psychically, as a representative for you guys. I know that there's a lot of anger, and I feel it. I know people are angry, and I know that we're angry about different things. And I know sometimes that turns into toxic speech, and many times it turns into hate speech. There are limits, of course, on what you can and can't say. They're defined by law, but we are breaking those laws and those norms every single day in the way that we talk to each other and the way that we behave with one another. And my struggle is, what do I do about that? Do I do what many have encouraged me to do, which is take off the gloves and throw down and say the same things that people say to me? I appreciate that as a piece of advice, but it's just not who I am. And I also don't think that that's something that helps. What my job is for us is to represent us. I don't think it's a representative way of behaving poorly or with hate. And I don't know how to give people advice other than to say my personal choice has been not to meet that with what I consider to be toxic hate. I worry a lot because back to the question of, is this a constitutional crisis that we're existing under right now? Gosh, I don't want to be wrong. Like, it's a little bit like global warming. If you're going to sit there and say it's not real, okay, but what if you're wrong? And that's what I worry about with all this stuff. Like, what if I'm wrong, that I really ought to be screaming and, all the things. What if I struggle with this too, guys, is I guess what I'm trying to say. That there's just no good answer that I can give you other than be yourself, and I would ask of you to behave and to be good people. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
I think we actually can go back to this nameless question because it's a good question. How does or can the Constitution relate to the first peoples who have been disenfranchised, even contemporarily? How can the Constitution address colonial legacy?
Wow. That's a deep one.
Great question.
The scholar.
Well, the question of the Constitution and Native American rights is both crucial historically, and as it happens, it's being debated on the current Supreme Court. And surprising to some, the greatest champion of Native American rights on the courts right now is Justice Neil Gorsuch. He's a co-chair of the National Constitution Center along with Justice Stephen Breyer. They've decided to do it together to signal their bipartisan commitment. But because of his experience in Colorado, Justice Gorsuch has been arguing for a textualist interpretation of the clauses of the Constitution that relate to Native American rights, and has insisted, for example, that large parts of Oklahoma should remain under tribal jurisdiction, should be free to set their own criminal codes, and also, most importantly, that all of the treaties that the U.S. has made over the course of history that have been ignored and thwarted and broken by a succession of presidents actually be respected. It's just a really important area to learn about. There's a great new book by Ned Blackhawk at Yale University, a kind of definitive history of Native American rights in the Constitution. It's the most tragic story, just from the beginning, of broken promises, betrayed rights, and broken treaties. But again, it's empowering to learn about the debates, and it sounds like nowadays, with Justice Gorsuch and some others on the court, there may be some chance of legal redress.
Well, maybe that's a new podcast that you can do, but I think that there's just so much that we should understand better, and I appreciate your knowledge on that.
Absolutely.
Next question.
This question is from Josie. What's the plan against proposed gerrymandering to sway the upcoming midterm elections in the House?
Can you read that one again?
What's the plan against proposed gerrymandering to sway the upcoming midterm elections in the House?
Yeah, this is another one where I really, really struggle. One of my daughters lives in Texas. She lives in Austin, and right now I think there are 5 or 6 representatives just for Austin, because of how right now it's gerrymandered into sort of a spider issue. The Texas legislature, I guess, just came out with a map today that would give Republicans, I think, 5 or 8 seats, depending on how you look at it. It's bananas, it's ridiculous, it's criminal, or it ought to be. And the answer, in my opinion, can't always be, well, we're just going to do it to them. It has to stop. And at the same time, Democrats need depends on how you argue about it, to be able to flip the House. so that we can be a check and balance against the current administration. I think Congress, frankly, and the government works best when there's a balance, when there's not a full run that either party has on all of the different parts of the government. And so what happens? It sounds like Ohio might do this. It sounds like Texas might do this. It sounds like Florida might do this on the red side. It sounds like California might do it on the blue side, and New York might do it on the blue side. And then where are we? You know, we're just sitting there, and then really who's representing you? And they're picking you. And I think that that's just tragic. The problem is that that's right now, as far as I understand it, not a federal issue. This is a state's issue, and I think it ought to be. But this is another one of those, aside from calling your representatives and saying this is crazy, what else can you do? You can get involved in these issues. Unfortunately, most of the bluer states have these independent, groups at this point in time because they've tried in some ways to fix this. And then, unfortunately, some of the red states still have the ability to do it anytime. It's completely legal what Texas is doing. And so there's really not a whole lot that we can collectively do aside from, leave Texas, I guess. But that doesn't help the representation of all of us in Washington, D.C. I don't know, you probably don't have any expertise in gerrymandering. I know Pennsylvania went through our own issue of that. And I feel as though we're in a better place in the sense that we have compact and consolidated districts. But there still is, Berks County is part of my district. And Berks has 3 members of Congress. And I don't know how, we can't take 57 or however many counties there are and not have broken, counties. It has to happen. But it makes the people of Berks not necessarily as well represented as the people of Chester County are. Next question.
Question with multiple questions along the lines of this one. Annalise asks, does ICE's current conduct conflict with the Constitution?
ICE. I believe so. And I know that there's a court case that was introduced today by some of my colleagues. This is also a Schoolhouse Rock moment for all of us. There are very few things that members of Congress can do with standing, meaning that we can sue somebody and say that we're the named, plaintiff in that. But apparently one thing that we can do is today, I think 12 of my colleagues sued the administration about ICE not allowing us in. Because we're being denied entry into the facilities. And for whatever reason, again, not a lawyer, we must have the standing to be able to do that. I don't believe what's happening right now with our local and state government being asked to do things that I don't think are appropriate, and in some cases I don't believe them to be legal, is okay. I also don't believe it's okay to use our military in the way that it's being used. And I've been pretty darn vocal about that in particular because that's my lane. The military and military personnel and military bases is literally what I do in Congress right now on the Military Personnel Committee. I'm the senior ranking person on the Democratic side on that committee. So that's where I try to have a voice, is to say that it's not okay to house folks on military bases, which they're trying to do in New Jersey, as an example, that it's not okay to take $1 billion of money that I appropriated, my committee appropriated for military housing to be improved, to move it to the border. That's not okay. And so I guess what I would say is I don't believe a lot of this stuff is legal. But it's for the courts to decide these things, and it's unfortunately a long and winding process that sometimes doesn't seem to go the way I think it ought to go, and sometimes seems to go the way I think it ought to go, but I think it remains to be seen. Now, this is a place where we, as a collective Congress, has our responsibility, and we're failing. We have the job to pass the laws, to be able to decide what immigration looks like, to be able to decide what it means to have borders, safe borders. We have abdicated that responsibility in Congress, and we were within, I think, a pretty close opportunity of being able to pass some bipartisan legislation about 1.5 years ago, when that was scuttled by who is now currently our president. With one tweet, it went away. literally overnight, there were 20 Republicans in the Senate who were ready to vote for that piece of legislation that would have helped us collectively, bipartisanly, reform our immigration system. And with one tweet, those 20 people disappeared. And so this is why Congress needs to do its job, why I need to do a better job. Next question. And I think we only have time for maybe one more because
This will be
I
the
have some
last
closing
question.
Yeah.
Yes. And again, those questions that we did not get to or comments will receive a response from the Congresswoman's office. This question, the last one, is from Colin. He says, "Good day. As a recent Great Valley graduate, something I quite care about is education. What will you do to ensure Chester County's schools get the proper funding from the government? I don't want to see our schools get left behind. Likewise with college funding, as I have many friends going to college. I'm going to Temple. They should all get proper funding."
Thank you, Colin, first of all, for being here wherever you are, and for representing your generation, because it's really important to participate. And secondly, thank you very much for the question, because education, as I've told you a little bit about my heritage, is the one thing my dad says that they can't take away from you. And so this is the equalizer, the great equalizer. A lot of the answer to your question lies with the state in some ways. A lot of funding that goes to schools, both our K through 12 and our upper schools, upper level schools, actually comes from the states. But there is a significant amount of policy as well as money that comes from the federal government as well. And we're doing everything we can to block and tackle right now on the undoing of a lot of the resources that have been sent to our community. A great example is $57 million was allocated to the the high school in Reading to be able to build a STEM addition to their high school, public addition to be able to have a STEM, brand new STEM building. That $57 million was pulled out from under them about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and we did all kinds of things, crazy things, as so did the governor, to try to bring that money back, and thankfully we were able to bring that money back. But that's also crazy. Again, we're going back to this Constitution. It's crazy that money that was appropriated by Congress on both sides of the aisle is being sucked and taken away in the area of education. And we ought to be screaming about that to the degree that I scream. And we ought to also be screaming about the unraveling of the Department of Education. That's insane. And so hopefully we are all collectively doing everything we can, I from where I sit and you from where you sit, to be able to protect all this, because the people who are vulnerable here are the people, in the case of the money that comes from the federal government, that 1% or so, or 10% that is comes from the federal government, is usually for the kids who need it most, for the programs that we need most. You've seen it also with the big beautiful bill, or big awful bill that was just passed, where we were winding down funding for feeding children in schools. My kids, the kids I taught at Gratz, 98% were on free and reduced lunch and breakfast. And the idea that you would sit there and have that child not be able to have something in their stomach while you're teaching them is outrageous. So what am I doing? I'm raging. What am I doing? I'm showing up to work every single day. I'm also bringing experience, having been an educator and having been a parent, to explain why it's important that I have a nephew who's 25, who's autistic, and he's gone through the school system, and I want to make sure that nephews like him get opportunities in education and be able to have productive lives and jobs when they get out of the schools, the mainstream schools as well. So I'm raging about that. I hope that you guys are too. There's all kinds of legislation that I could point to that would be like, and this is how I feel about student loans, and this is how I feel about making sure there's diversity in the educational curriculum, making sure that we're learning more about STEM and mathematical and statistical modeling. I could tell you all of those kinds of things. But while we're busy just destroying education, it doesn't matter what piece of legislation my name is on that won't necessarily get its time on the floor this Congress. What matters is that we need to fight back, and we need to be able to have the ability to have Congress working again, to be able to legislate again, and to be able to make sure that we value the things that I know our community values, which is education above all. And so you get me exercised on something like this. This is why Before Congress, this is what I was doing. I was running a nonprofit about literacy, early childhood literacy. This was what I thought was the crisis of our time. And instead now I think the crisis of our time is our government, our own government. And that's why I'm here. Well, guys, I want to first of all say thank you. I have one last question for you, sir, and it has to do with something that we were doing some research about you before before this event. And apparently 3 years ago in the Wall Street Journal, there was a piece that you participated in, and it was about the 2020 election and whether or not it was there was an attempt to overturn it. And you talked a lot about the founding fathers and the likelihood that they said in their grand experiment of self-government, would it survive? You've talked a little bit about Thomas Jefferson and the factions that would divide and destroy the country today, and John Adams you also spoke about too. And your quote in this article is something that I want to know how you feel about it today. Among the founding generation, only James Madison was moderately optimistic that American institutions would survive. He hoped that public opinion would be educated to overcome the most destructive partisan passions. He had faith that, among other things, a class of enlightened literati would use the new technologies of print media to diffuse the cool voice of reason throughout the land. So 250 years after this, what do you think?
I mean,
Is our grand experiment
No,
working?
that's the central question. And all the other founders think that we're going to go the way of Greece and Rome. Jefferson fears civil war. Hamilton thinks the president isn't strong enough. Only Madison has some faith, and it's because of his faith in education and the media. And he thinks when citizens have this great new technology, the broadside press, and they read complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers, and they discuss them in town halls like this one, and they listen to different points of view, then reason can slowly diffuse across the land. Well, if everyone's like you guys, then we're going to be just fine. But of course, that's not our major media environment, and a world of enraged to engage and posts based on anger and passion travel further than those based on reason. We're in real trouble. But the main thing goes back to my takeaway from my crazy reading project. We've got to read. You know, unless people are going to inform themselves, take an hour, as you've done. These are complicated arguments. You've listened to a thoughtful representative grapple with them. You're disagreeing respectfully. We got to do this. I have to say, when I've got the best job in the world because I see the best of America. I travel around, go to gatherings like this in red and blue America, in rural bookstores, in local churches where 500 people will gather to talk about founding principles. Doesn't matter if you're liberal or conservative. Americans really care a lot about the future, but it's the people, and that's why these face-to-face gatherings are so much. So I guess that's what I'll leave us with. As long as people continue to do exactly what you're doing, gather together, read and inform yourself, then America will survive.
And again, thank you very much for coming and sharing your knowledge with us. And I have just a couple conclusions as well, and I know that they're on a slide or two. Okay, so here's what I want to conclude with. Thank you, everyone, all of you, everyone who agreed with me, who disagreed with me, who has opinions, who agree with mine or don't. I appreciate you, and I appreciate the calls that we get, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness. And I would like to present to you, if you liked what you saw, or if you didn't like what you saw, what can you do? Here's some things. One is to communicate with your government, as you guys do, with local, state, and federal. Recognize that there are 3 different levels of it and that we don't all do the same thing, that your voice matters. Let us know your stories, and when you really have experiences, it really helps us to be able to elevate them. Let us know if you need help with anything that has to do with the federal government. We are here to help, really. And support organizations that are working on causes that matter to you. It helps elevate and multiply your voice. The next slide and the last one. If you don't or do like what you just saw, vote, 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 vote. Twice a year, please vote. Twice a year, every year, please vote. Follow me and other people on social media, and also importantly, please sign up for my newsletter, and please differentiate between communications that come from a campaign
and communications that come from an official account, because they ought to be the same, meaning that you shouldn't see two different voices saying two different things. But there is a difference between my official newsletter and a campaign email that will say something about a barbecue, you know, or something like that. So make sure you're signed up for the official email. Remember, we are in 50-50, actually 40-40-20. This district is 40% Democrat, 40% Republican, 20% independent. 50% of you guys don't agree with each other. And that's okay. We have to talk to each other. And that's what my job is to try to listen. Thank you very much for coming. For those of you who didn't get a chance to answer questions, we will follow up. For those of you who have follow-on questions, we will follow up. I appreciate you guys very much, and I'll let you out of here, unfortunately, 6 minutes late. Thank you very much. Thank you. Are you freezing? Oh my God, I'm so freezing. I'm sorry it's cold in here.